My name is Alex, and I've always had a fascination with the wild. I grew up surrounded by forests, so hiking and camping became second nature to me. But the one place I swore never to return to was Black Hollow, a forest that hides more than it reveals. Black Hollow isn't marked on most maps, and the locals avoid it at all costs. They tell stories of a creature-shadowed predator that hunts those who venture too deep into its territory. Of course, I didn't believe in any of it. After all, there's no such thing as monsters, right? But that was before I met it. I was on a solo hike, following an old path I had heard about from a park ranger who seemed a little too eager to share the tale. The path led deeper into Black Hollow, to a place known as the Silent Grove, a spot I'd never dared to venture. I figured it was time to prove the stories wrong. At first, everything seemed normal, quiet, still, with only the rustling of leaves in the wind. But as I moved deeper into the grove, the forest began to change. The trees became darker, their trunks thicker and more twisted, as if something unnatural had warped the land, and that's when I felt Ita's presence. Something was watching me. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it grew stronger. Every sound in the forest suddenly seemed amplified. The crack of a twig breaking, the sound of my breathing, my footsteps on the soft earth. I turned around, but no one was there. That's when I saw it, a figure, standing motionless between the trees. At first, it seemed like another hiker, but something about the way it stood perfectly still, perfectly silent was wrong. I called out, but the figure didn't move. I stepped forward cautiously, my heart pounding. That's when it shifted. It didn't walk toward me. It didn't run. It was as if it teleported, appearing just inches away, its shadow stretching unnaturally. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body froze. And then, it spoke. Its voice was low, gravelly, and felt like it came from deep within. The earth. You shouldn't be here. I didn't wait to hear more. I bolted. I ran faster than I ever had before, the sound of footsteps behind me echoing through the trees. But no matter how fast I ran, the footsteps were always just a little faster, always just a little closer. I dared to glance over my shoulder, and that's when I saw Ita blur, a shadow that darted from tree to tree, staying just out of sight, but always near. I didn't know how long I ran. It felt like hours, but eventually, I stumbled out of the forest and onto a road. My heart was racing, and I couldn't breathe properly. I made it to my car and slammed the door shut, trembling. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I looked out the window, and in the distance, standing among the trees, I saw it again. The figure was watching me, its head tilted, as if it was waiting for me to make the next move. I never went back to Black Hollow after that. I haven't even told anyone about what happened. But sometimes, when I'm hiking in other forests, I'll feel that same uneasy gaze, like something is following me, waiting for me to slip up. And I know one thing for certain, the silent hunter is still out there. My name is Lucas, and I work as a wildlife photographer. I've spent years traveling to some of the most remote forests in the world, but nothing has ever terrified me like what I encountered in Jalapeno Woods. It was supposed to be a simple, solo trip, just me, my camera, and miles of untouched wilderness. I had heard whispers about strange occurrences in Jalapeno, but I shrugged them off as local superstition. That was a mistake. The first 2 days were uneventful. I captured stunning shots of rare birds, towering pines, and the golden light filtering through the dense canopy. But on the third day, the fog rolled in. At first it seemed normal, just a morning mist settling between the trees. But it didn't burn off with the rising sun. It only grew thicker, swallowing the forest in a dense, unnatural white. And then, the whispers began. They came from everywhere and nowhere, soft and distant, like dozens of voices murmuring just beyond my reach. I spun around, my camera shaking in my hands, but there was no one there. I told myself it was the wind. Then, I saw the shadows. Figures. Tall and thin, barely visible through the fog. They moved between the trees in a way that wasn't natural, shifting in and out of focus, like distorted reflections in water. I tried to head back to camp, but no matter which way I walked, I ended up in the same clearing over and over again. My tracks should have been in the dirt, but they weren't. The fog was hiding them. Then the whispers turned into laughter, low, broken laughter that didn't belong to anything human. It echoed all around me, and I realized the figures weren't staying in the distance anymore. They were getting closer. A shape moved past me, just inches away, a blur of something wrong, something that shouldn't exist. I ran. I don't know how long I ran, but suddenly, I burst out of the fog and into blinding sunlight. My car was there. The road was there. But when I turned around, the forest was completely clear. No fog, no figures, no whispers, just endless trees. I told myself it was a hallucination, exhaustion, a trick of my mind. But when I checked my camera, later, there were dozens of photos I didn't remember taking. Blurry images of tall, faceless shapes standing in the fog, and in the last picture one of them was right behind me. My name is Ethan, and I've always been a skeptic. I've spent years hiking through forests, exploring caves, and trekking through places others wouldn't dare to go. But nothing in all my experiences prepared me for the horrors of Ashgrove Forest. It started as an ordinary hiking trip. I had heard rumors of disappearances near the northern part of Ashgrove, but I dismissed them as nothing more than campfire stories. There's no such thing as ghosts, right? I should have listened. The moment I entered the northern section of Ashgrove, I felt the air grow cold. A heavy fog had already rolled in, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. But I pressed on, determined to prove there was nothing to fear. After a few hours of walking, the trail seemed to vanish. The dense fog made it hard to discern the path, and the trees grew thicker. Their roots twisted like veins snaking through the ground. That's when I noticed the unease, the silent tension in the air. I was being watched. The feeling was subtle at first, a slight shiver down my spine, like the hairs on the back of my neck were rising. But then, the whispers started. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the whispers weren't natural. They were low, almost mournful, like a voice that sounded too close. I froze. That's when I saw them. Eyes, thousands of them, glimmering in the shadows beneath the trees. They weren't the eyes of animals or birds, they were human eyes, staring from the ground itself. I dropped my backpack and scrambled backwards, my heart pounding in my chest. The eyes followed me, their gaze unwavering, but the figures they belonged to remained hidden in the thick fog. I turned and ran, my legs burning, but every step felt heavier than the last. The eyes seemed to multiply, surrounding me from all sides. Suddenly, I tripped over something, a root, or so I thought. But when I looked down, I realized it was something else. It was a hand, a skeletal hand, half buried in the dirt. It was reaching up, clawing its way from beneath the earth. And that's when I realized the eyes weren't just watching me. They were waiting for me to join them. I struggled to get up, but the ground beneath me was soft, like I was sinking into the earth itself. The more I tried to pull myself free, the tighter the soil seemed to grip me. The whispers grew louder, their voices rising into screams. And then, I saw it. A figure, shrouded in mist, emerging from the fog. It was tall, with long, shadowy limbs that seemed to stretch toward me. But what terrified me the most was its face, or the lack of one. There was nothing but a gaping void, blacker than the night. And from that void, a single word echoed in my mind: join us. I don't remember how I got out of the forest. One moment, I was sinking into the earth, and the next, I was standing in the clearing, the fog gone. The eyes had disappeared, and everything was eerily silent. I've never told anyone what happened that day, but I'll never forget those eyes, or the feeling of being swallowed by the ground itself. And to this day, I still see them sometimes watching me from the corners of my vision, lurking just beneath the earth. My name is Sarah, and I've spent most of my life in the mountains. Hiking, camping, and exploring the wilderness is in my blood. But there's one trail I will never go near again. It's called the Forgotten Path, a barely marked route through Whispering Pines Forest that's been long abandoned. Locals say it's a place to avoid, that something in the woods doesn't want you to find it. I didn't believe them. I had been exploring these woods for years, so when I found a faded map in an old cabin near the edge of the forest, I didn't hesitate. I decided to follow the forgotten trail to see what was so dangerous about it. The first few miles were easy enough. The path was overgrown, but not impossible to follow. As I went deeper into the forest, I felt an odd tension in the air, but I pushed it aside. The sounds of the forest were familiar, rustling leaves, chirping birds, so I kept going. But as I walked, I noticed the trees were changing. They were taller, their trunks twisted, and their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. The deeper I went, the more unnatural they looked. And then, I heard it. A whispered at first, I thought it was the wind, but the longer I listened, the clearer it became. The voice was human, but it was muffled, as if coming from beneath the earth. I stopped in my tracks, my heart racing. Another whisper, this time louder. Turn back. You shouldn't be here. I should have turned back. I really should have. But instead, I kept walking. I couldn't help myself. I had to know. Then, I found it. A clearing dot. At first, it looked normal. But as I stepped closer, I saw the ruins of a crumbling stone structure, half buried beneath the earth. It looked ancient, like it hadn't been touched for centuries. And scattered around it were bones, hundreds of them. Some were human, some animal, but they were all crushed, like they had been trampled. There were no bodies, just the remains. I felt a wave of nausea. I turned to leave, but the path behind me was gone. The trees had closed in. The clearing was cut off from the rest of the forest, and the air felt heavier, like I was walking through a dream. That's when I saw it. A figure, standing in the shadows, barely visible. Its face was shrouded in darkness, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure stepped forward, its long, twisted limbs reaching out toward me. That's when the whispers turned into screams. I don't remember much after that. The next thing I knew, I was lying on the forest floor, gasping for air. The sun was setting, and the path had returned to normal. But I never spoke about what I saw, not to anyone, and I never went back to Whispering Pines again. My name is Daniel, and I used to love hiking alone. The deeper into the forest I went, the safer I felt until the day I learned something was watching me. It started as a simple weekend trip. I chose Everwood National Park, a place known for its ancient trees and untouched wilderness. I packed light, planning to set up camp near a quiet stream I had marked on my map. The first day was perfect. The air was crisp, the sun warm, and the woods alive with the sounds of nature. But as night fell, something changed. The forest went silent. Not just quiet, completely dead. No wind, no insects, nothing. It was like the trees themselves were holding their breath. Then I saw it, perched high in the branches. Nearly 30 feet above me was a figure. It was humanoid, but wrong, its limbs too long, its body thin and twisted. It had no face, just a smooth, pale surface, where its features should be. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a shadow, my mind playing games. Then it moved, not like a person climbing down, but like a spider, scuttling between branches. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it upwards. The light hit empty branches, the thing was gone. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I swore I heard scraping sounds above me. The next day, I decided to head back early, but the deeper I walked into the forest, the more I realized I wasn't going the right way. My map said I should have been near the main trail, but the trees around me were strange, twisted into unnatural shapes, their bark covered in deep gashes like claw marks. That's when I saw the footprints. They weren't mine, and they weren't human. The prints were long, almost talon-like, and they circled me like something had been watching me sleep all night. I ran. I didn't care about direction anymore. I just needed to get out. The trees blurred around me, the world twisting like a nightmare, until I saw it again, hanging upside down from a branch directly above me, its faceless head inches from my own. I don't remember screaming. I don't remember running. The next thing I knew, I was stumbling out of the woods, gasping for breath. My car was right where I left it, but when I got inside, my hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel, and in the rearview mirror, I swear, just for a second, I saw something hanging from the trees behind me, watching, waiting. My name is Ethan, and I work as a forestry researcher. My job takes me deep into untouched forests, mapping ecosystems, studying wildlife, and sometimes finding things that shouldn't exist. Last fall, I was sent to Grey Hollow Forest, an area that had been closed off for decades due to unexplained disappearances. The local legends warned of a curse that the forest itself was alive, and that something ancient slept beneath its roots. I don't believe in curses, but I do believe in what I saw. The first few days were uneventful, just miles of dense woodland, towering oaks and pines, their roots thick and tangled. But then, on the fourth day, I found the pit. It was a perfect circle, about 10 feet wide, going straight down into darkness. The edges weren't natural. The soil looked like it had been burned away. I dropped a rock inside and counted. No sound, no bottom. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind carried a strange humming noise, like something deep underground was breathing. The next morning, I found something new near the pit. Handprints. Dozens of them, pressed into the dirt, all leading out of the hole. Some were too large, others were too small, like they belonged to something that had never been human. I tried to radio for help. Static. That night, I heard scraping sounds outside my tent. Slow, deliberate, like something was dragging itself through the dirt. I held my breath, listening, then the ground beneath me shifted. It was subtle at first, a gentle vibration. Then, suddenly a deep, guttural groan from beneath the earth. I scrambled out of my tent, my flashlight flickering. The pit was closer than before. That wasn't possible. I grabbed my gear and ran. The humming grew louder, turning into a chorus of whispers. My head pounded, my vision blurred, and for a split second, I swore I saw something, a shape, massive and writhing, just beneath the roots of the trees. I didn't stop running until I reached my truck. I reported everything, but no one believed me. When I returned a week later with a team, the pit was gone. No sign it had ever been there. But sometimes, when I walk in the woods, I still hear that humming noise beneath my feet, and I know it's still down there, waiting. My name is Adam, and I grew up in a small town surrounded by endless miles of forest. As kids, we always heard the stories about the hanging tree, a massive, gnarled oak deep in the woods where, according to legend, dozens of people had ended their lives. I never believed the tales, at least not until I saw it for myself. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip, just me and my two best friends, Kyle and Ben. We packed our gear, hiked deep into Blackridge Forest, and found the perfect spot to set up camp. That first night, everything felt off. The trees were too still, the air too silent. Even the usual sounds of crickets and owls were absent. But the worst part, the nightmares. We all had them. I dreamt I was hanging from a tree branch, my body swaying in the wind, but I was still alive, fully aware, unable to scream. Kyle woke up gasping, saying he felt like something was choking him in his sleep. He refused to talk about what he saw. The next day, we found it. The hanging tree stood alone in a clearing, its branches twisted and blackened, scars from centuries of storms and decay. The bark was covered in deep claw marks, as if something had tried to climb out of it, and beneath it were the ropes. Dozens of them, some fresh, some so old they were nearly fused into the tree itself. "Let's go back," I said. Ben just stood there, staring at the tree, his eyes unfocused. "We should leave," Kyle muttered. That's when Ben started walking toward the tree. "Ben?" I grabbed his arm, but his body was cold unnaturally so. His lips moved, but the words were wrong. Not his voice, not his language. And then, his eyes rolled back. The ropes moved. They reached down, coiling toward him like something alive. Kyle and I pulled him away, running as fast as we could, the air behind us thick with whispers. By the time we got back to camp, Ben collapsed, gasping for breath like he had been drowning. That night, we took turns keeping watch. But just before dawn, I looked over and saw Ben standing at the edge of the woods, staring back at the hanging tree. His lips moved, whispering something I couldn't understand. We packed up and left the second the sun came up. Ben never talked about what happened, but sometimes I catch him staring at trees for too long, his fingers twitching like he's feeling for something that isn't there. And last week, I got a message from him, a single photo of a noose hanging from a tree. No words, just coordinates, right back to where it all began. My name is Lucas, and I used to love camping alone. The solitude, the quiet hum of nature, the disconnect from modern life, it was something I cherished. But after my last trip to Raven's Hollow, I don't think I'll ever step into a forest. Again, it started with the fog. I had hiked for most of the day, deep into an untouched part of the woods. By sunset, I found a clearing near a small lake, a perfect campsite. I set up my tent, built a fire, and let the exhaustion of the day settle into my bones. Then, out of nowhere, a thick fog rolled in. I've seen mist in the woods before, but this was different. It was dense, clinging to the trees, like a living thing, swallowing my surroundings until my fire was the only visible point. Even my own hands looked blurred in front of me. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, just beyond the wall of fog. At first I assumed it was an animal, a deer, maybe, but then I realized the steps were circling me. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the mist. Nothing, but the footsteps continued, crunching over leaves, moving around my camp in a perfect circle. "Hello," I called out. My voice felt swallowed by the fog. Silence, then a whisper. It was so faint, I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. But as I strained to listen, I heard it again, this time right behind me. I spun around. There was nothing there. The fog pressed against me, suffocating, twisting the shapes of trees into bent, unnatural figures. And then, out of the mist, I saw it. A tall, skeletal figure emerged, its limbs too long, its head tilting unnaturally. Its body shifted like it was made of the fog itself, flowing with the mist. It had no eyes, no mouth, just a gaping void, where its face should have been. It took a step toward me. I grabbed my pack and ran. I didn't care where. I just knew I had to get away. The whispers followed me, twisting into words I almost understood. My legs burned. My lungs screamed for air. But I kept running until the fog vanished. I stumbled onto the main trail. The trees normal again, the air crisp and clear. The sun had risen, as if no time had passed. But my watch, It was still stuck at 2:37 a.m. I don't know what I saw that night, but I do know one thing: Raven's Hollow doesn't want visitors. And if the fog ever finds you, don't listen to the whispers. My name is Eric, and I was a park ranger for 10 years. I've seen my fair share of weird things in the woods, but nothing prepared me for what happened last fall in Redfern Forest. It started with a simple call. A hiker, Clara Mitchell, had gone missing. She was an experienced solo camper, familiar with the area, but hadn't returned as scheduled. Her last known location was near Foxglove Trail, a path infamous for one eerie detail. It had no official records. It didn't exist on any park map. I set out early in the morning, following her last GPS ping. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest became. No birds, no rustling leaves, just a heavy, unnatural silence. After about an hour, I spotted a backpack near a cluster of moss-covered stones. Clara's. That's when I saw the footprints. They lead deeper into the forest, but something was off. There was only one set of footprints, leading forward, none coming back. I followed them. The trees grew denser, twisted, their branches reaching toward me like skeletal fingers. The path seemed wrong, like the ground itself was shifting beneath my boots. And then I saw her. Clara was standing in the middle of the path, perfectly still, facing away from me. "Clara," I called. She didn't move. I stepped closer, the air turning thick and heavy, my breath coming out in short gasps. Something was deeply, horribly wrong. I reached out and she turned. Her eyes were completely black. Her mouth stretched open in a silent scream, but no sound came out. The world around me warped. The trees seemed to pulse and breathe. I wasn't in Redfern anymore. I stumbled backward, my radio crackling to life. A voice, my own voice, came through. "Don't turn around. Don't look back. Run." Every instinct screamed at me to obey. I bolted, not caring where I was going, only that I needed to leave. The whispering started, then low, guttural sounds from behind me. I didn't look. I couldn't. After what felt like hours, I burst into a clearing. The normal forest was back. The sky was normal. The sounds of birds chirping returned. But the path I had just come from, it was gone. No trail, no disturbed leaves, nothing. We never found Clara. The official report says she disappeared without a trace. But I know the truth. She never left that path. And neither did the thing wearing her face. My name is Daniel, and I've spent most of my life hiking and camping in remote places. The wilderness has always been my escape, my sanctuary. That is, until I ventured into Blackwood Forest. Blackwood had a reputation. People went missing there. Some said it was because of wild animals. Others claimed it was the terrain. But there were whispers, old legends about something watching. I never believed in such things. Not until I saw them. I set up camp deep in the woods, far from any trails. The first night was peaceful. The only sounds were the rustling leaves and distant hoots of an owl. But when I woke up the next morning, I noticed something odd. The fire I had put out the night before was relit, burning low but steady. I was sure I had extinguished it. Maybe I was just tired. I brushed it off and went about my day, exploring deeper into the forest. That's when I found the carving stall, thin figures etched into the trees, always in pairs, always watching. Some were old, nearly faded away, but others looked fresh. I felt uneasy. That night, I awoke to a faint whispering outside my tent. It was distant, almost like the wind, but there was a rhythm to it. It didn't sound like English or any language I recognized. My heart pounded. I wasn't alone. I slowly unzipped my tent, peeking outside. The fire was still burning, but I hadn't lit it again. And then, I saw them. Two tall figures stood at the edge of my campsite. They were impossibly thin, their limbs elongated, their heads tilted unnaturally to the side, watching. No eyes, no mouths, just smooth, pale skin stretched too tight over bone. I couldn't move. My body refused to obey as the figures slowly stepped forward, their movements jerky, unnatural. The whispering grew louder, almost inside my skull, like it was being spoken directly into my mind. And then, they vanished. One blink, and they were gone. But the whispering didn't stop. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At dawn, I packed up and ran. I didn't care where, as long as I got out of the forest. But as I reached the tree line, something stopped me cold. The carvings on the trees, they had changed. Instead of pairs, there was only one figure now, and it looked exactly like me. I never went back to Blackwood, but sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I swear I still hear the whispering, and I know they're still watching. I had been on the road for hours, my eyes heavy from the long drive. The highway stretched out in front of me, nothing but endless asphalt and the occasional sign pointing to a motel or a gas station. When I saw the sign for Whispering Pines Motel, I decided it was time to pull over. The rain had started coming down in sheets, and the faint glow of the neon sign seemed like a beacon in the storm. The motel was small and somewhat run down, tucked between two tall pines that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. The office was dark, but the door was ajar, so I walked in. A bell rang above me as I entered, and a man stood behind the counter. His face was pale, almost ghostly, and his hair was thinning. He didn't say a word at first, just stared at me with eyes that seemed far too tired for someone his age. After a moment, he cleared his throat. "Room 12, he muttered, tossing me a key. "There's only one other guest tonight, but be careful after dark." I took the key, my curiosity piqued. "Why?" His gaze hardened for a moment before he leaned in closer. "The thing about this place, it's never empty, even when it seems like it is." Confused but not wanting to press, I nodded and made my way to the room. Room 12 was on the second floor, its door creaking as I pushed it open. The room smelled musty, the air damp with the remnants of the storm. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper, and the furniture was old and worn. It wasn't much, but it would do for the night. As I sat on the bed, trying to shake off the weariness, I noticed something strange, a dark figure standing at the window, staring out into the rain. I froze. The figure didn't move, not even a twitch. I blinked, and it was gone. Shaking my head, I chalked it up to exhaustion and tried to shake off the unease that had crept into my chest. But as the night went on, the feeling only grew stronger. Around midnight, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside my door, soft and deliberate, like someone was pacing back and forth in front of it. I held my breath, my ears straining for any sign of who or what was out there. I opened the door cautiously, but there was no one, just the empty hallway, the dim light flickering overhead. The footsteps resumed, but this time they were inside the room. I spun around, heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps echoed, yet no one was there. The sound grew louder, closer. They were coming from the corner of the room, but all I could see was the darkened space. And then, I saw it. A figure, not quite human, but something else. Its eyes were wide black pits, and its mouth stretched into a grin that shouldn't have been possible. It stood there, motionless, just watching me. My legs went numb as I stumbled backward, tripping over the bed as I tried to escape. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence, suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. The door slammed shut behind me. I was trapped in the room with it. The figure slowly stepped forward, its grin widening. It was so still, so silent, I could barely hear it breathing. The only sound in the room was the soft, rhythmic thumping of my own heart. Then it spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." I froze, my mind racing for an explanation, for any way out. But the words were too much, too terrifying. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. The figure took another step toward me, and I thought I would faint from fear. But just before it reached me, it stopped, its head tilting to the side. Its grin faded, replaced by a look of confusion. "You're not the one." The figure backed away, fading into the shadows of the room, as though it had never been there at all. The air became still once more, but the chill lingered. I stood there, frozen, unable to process what had just happened. I reached for the door handle, my hands trembling, and opened it quickly. But when I looked out into the hallway, I was met with the same eerie silence. The man from the office stood at the end of the hallway, his pale face watching me. He didn't speak, but his eyes told me everything I needed to know. This place wasn't just haunted by ghosts, it was inhabited by something far worse. I didn't stay another minute. I grabbed my things and ran to my car, not looking back. And as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that, somewhere in the distance, I could still hear those footsteps. It was late, well past midnight, when I pulled into the driveway of the Hollow Pines Motel. The neon sign above the office buzzed, casting an eerie glow on the gravel parking lot. The motel was small, tucked away on a lonely stretch of highway, with trees crowding it on all sides. The air had a strange stillness to it, as if the world around the place had been paused. I was exhausted from the long drive and just wanted a place to sleep. I walked into the dimly lit office, where the scent of stale coffee lingered in the air. A woman sat behind the counter, her face pale and drawn, but her eyes were alert and calculating. She didn't smile, just handed me a room key with a steady hand. "Room 5. No one else is staying tonight," she said flatly. "Stay inside after dark, and don't open the door for anyone." I nodded, slightly unnerved by her tone, and took the key from her. There was something about her manner, her tone, that felt wrong. But it was late, and I was too tired to question it. Room 5 wasn't fancy. The carpet was stained, the furniture old, and the air thick with dust. But it would do. I locked the door behind me and flopped onto the bed, the exhaustion pulling me into sleep almost immediately. I don't know how much time passed when I woke up to a faint sound on knocking. Soft at first, like someone tapping on the door. I sat up, heart pounding, wondering if I had imagined it. I waited in silence for a moment, and then I heard it again. Knock, knock, knock. It wasn't coming from the door I had locked. It was coming from the window. I stood frozen, staring at the glass, my breath caught in my throat. No one could have gotten into the room. I hadn't heard anyone enter. Still, the knocks persisted, growing louder, more frantic. I approached the window slowly, my hand trembling as I pulled back the curtain, just enough to peer outside. There was nothing, just the dense forest surrounding the motel, swaying in the wind, and the faint outline of trees stretching into the dark. But the knocking was still there, clear and insistent. It was coming from behind the window. Terrified, I backed away, glancing at the door, but still unsure of what to do. Should I open it? Would I even make it out if I did? The knocking turned into something else, a low scratching, like claws on glass. That's when I heard a voice, faint but growing clearer. "Let me in, ... The voice was distant at first, but then it was right at the window, as if someone or something was standing just outside. It was deep, distorted, and chilling. My body froze in fear, the blood draining from my face. "Let me in," the voice repeated, now louder, more urgent. I grabbed the chair beside the bed and wedged it against the door, trying to steady my trembling hands. The room was suffocating, the air thick with terror. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. My head spun. Suddenly, the room was plunged into darkness. The light bulb flickered, then went out completely. The temperature dropped in an instant, and I could see my breath forming in the cold air. The knocking on the window had stopped, but now I could hear something else shuffling, like footsteps, just outside. The door rattled, and I jumped back. I held my breath, hoping whatever was outside would go away. But the knocking continued now, from both the window and the door. "Let me in, ... It wasn't just one voice anymore. There were multiple voices, all echoing the same words, all filled with desperation. The door shook as though someone or something was trying to force its way inside. The scratching grew louder, more intense. I stumbled back to the window, heart racing, and pulled the curtain aside once more. But this time, I saw them, figures pale, gaunt, their eyes hollow and wide, their faces twisted in anguish. They were gathered around the window, their hands pressed against the glass. The scratching, the knocking, the voices, they were all coming from them. They weren't human. They were things, creatures, trapped outside, begging to be let in. I rushed to the door, my pulse thumping in my ears. I had to get out. I had to leave. But just as I reached for the doorknob, the door burst open. The woman from the office was standing there, her face contorted in an eerie smile, her eyes wide and unblinking. "You shouldn't have stayed." Before I could react, she stepped aside, revealing the creatures behind her, dozens of them, their eyes wide, their faces contorted in silent screams. They lunged at me, but I couldn't move, couldn't scream. I was frozen in place, staring into the abyss of their empty eyes. And then, everything went black. I was on a road trip, heading through a remote stretch of highway, when I saw the motel, the Silent Pines Motel, its neon sign flickering faintly in the dark. Tired and in need of a place to rest, I pulled into the parking lot. The silence was almost unnerving, like the world had forgotten this place existed. The office was small, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet as I entered. A man behind the counter greeted me with a smile, but something about him felt ... off. His skin was too pale, his eyes too wide. His greeting was far too warm for someone working at this forgotten establishment. "Room for the night?" I asked. He nodded and handed me a key with no hesitation. "Room 3, the key read. Everything you need is in the room. Just remember, stay in your room after dark." His warning was strange, but at that point, I just needed to rest. I thanked him and made my way to room 3. The hallway was dimly lit, the air stale and heavy. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was typical old furniture, a bed with worn sheets, and a television that looked like it hadn't been used in years. Yet something about it felt off, like the room itself was holding its breath. I set my things down and laid on the bed, my exhaustion taking over. But then I heard it, the softest, most delicate whisper. It was faint at first, like it was coming from the walls. I sat up, heart racing, straining to listen. "Help me, ... The voice was faint, almost imperceptible, but there was no mistaking it. It came again, louder this time, from the far corner of the room. My eyes darted over to where the sound originated, but the corner was empty. I stood up slowly, walking toward the corner where the voice had come from. The room seemed to grow colder with each step I took. As I reached the corner, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. There was nothing there, except for a small, old wooden cabinet. I hadn't noticed it before, but now it stood there, strangely out of place. I opened it, expecting to find some forgotten items from previous guests, but instead, I found nothing except for a small, folded note. I unfolded the note, my hands trembling as I read the scrawled handwriting. "I'm still here. You have to leave." I felt a chill run down my spine. The whispering returned, now louder, more frantic. The room began to shake, the walls groaning, as if they were alive. I backed away from the cabinet, my heart pounding. The door slammed shut behind me. Panic surged through me as I tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. My mind raced, My thoughts scattered. What was happening? Who was in here with me? I turned back to the bed, and that's when I saw a figure sitting at the foot of the bed, its face obscured by shadows. The whispering stopped, and an eerie silence settled over the room. The figure stood, slowly, its head tilting toward me. "You shouldn't have stayed." The voice was no longer a whisper, but a guttural growl. The figure stepped closer, its form shifting and warping like something not meant to be seen. I ran to the door, throwing my weight against it, but the figure was right behind me. I heard it breathe, its breath cold against my neck. "Leave this place, or you will never leave." With a final push, the door flew open. I bolted down the hallway, not daring to look back. When I reached the office, the man behind the counter was gone, leaving only an empty room. The motel was gone, too. The Silent Pines motel had vanished, leaving nothing but an empty stretch of road, but I can still hear the whispers in my mind, calling me back. I arrived at the motel after the sun had long since set, the highway behind me fading into darkness. The River's Edge Motel was small, nestled beside a creek that ran quietly through the woods. The building was weathered, the windows cracked, and the sign above the door flickered erratically in the wind. It looked like the type of place that had long been forgotten by the world. I went inside the office, the bell above the door chiming with a creak. Behind the counter sat an elderly man, his eyes dim and his skin pale. His hands shook slightly as he handed me the key, his voice low and strained. "You can stay in room 8, he said, "but don't go out after dark." I gave him a confused glance. Why not? He just stared at me, his lips quivering. "It's best not to disturb the watcher." That was all he said before he turned away, his gaze lingering on something outside the window, far beyond my view. I took the key, still unsettled by the man's strange behavior, and left. Room 8 wasn't much different from the rest of the motel. The furniture was outdated, and the wallpaper was peeling at the edges. I set my bag down and sat on the bed, but my mind was racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The air in the room felt heavy, thick, with an unspoken tension. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was just being paranoid. After all, it was just a motel. As I was about to lie down, I noticed a figure in the window outside. Standing there, motionless, was a tall man dressed in dark clothing, his face hidden in shadow. His presence was almost suffocating, his posture unnervingly still. I froze, staring at the figure. Was he watching me? I tried to look away, but my gaze kept returning to him. My heart thudded in my chest, the feeling of being watched growing stronger with every passing second. Suddenly, a loud knock echoed from the door. I jumped, my breath catching in my throat. But when I opened the door, no one was there. Confused and anxious, I returned to the window. The figure was still standing there, but now he was closer. My stomach churned as I realized he was no longer just watching. He was waiting. The whisper of wind brushed through the trees outside, and in the distance, I thought I heard something, a low, guttural voice. It sounded like chanting, but the words were indistinguishable. My skin crawled. I backed away from the window, my pulse racing. What was happening? Suddenly, the door slammed shut on its own. I rushed to open it, but the knob wouldn't turn. The room felt colder, the walls seeming to close in. The man outside was still there, staring at the window. The chanting grew louder, clearer now. I could make out the words. He watches, he waits, he takes. A chill ran down my spine as I backed toward the bed. The man's face suddenly appeared in the window, his eyes dark and hollow. "You can't leave." His voice was distorted, twisted with malice. Panicking, I tried once more to open the door. The knob turned, but the door wouldn't budge. My heart raced as the figure outside started to pound on the glass, his face now pressed against it. The glass rattled with each blow. In a frenzy, I pulled away from the window, my feet stumbling over the furniture as I backed toward the opposite wall. The air was thick with a sense of dread, the walls vibrating with an eerie hum. Then everything stopped. The pounding ceased, the chanting faded, and the room went completely silent. I cautiously approached the door again, my breath shallow. When I opened it, there was no one outside. The figure was gone. The motel was eerily quiet, as if nothing had ever happened. I ran outside into the night, not looking back until I reached my car. But when I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw him again, the figure standing by the edge of the trees, watching me. And that's when I understood. He wasn't just watching me. He was waiting. It was late when I pulled off the highway, the gas tank almost empty, the tiredness seeping into my bones. The neon lights of a small motel called the Hollow Oak Motel flickered in the distance, its sign barely visible in the thick fog rolling in from the woods. I had no other choice. I needed to rest. The office was old, the kind that smelled like dust and mildew. Behind the counter sat a man, maybe in his mid-40s, wearing a dark suit that seemed too formal for the setting. His hair was slicked back, his face pale, almost sickly. His eyes locked onto mine as I approached. "I need a room for the night," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer right away, just stared at me for what felt like an eternity. Finally, he reached under the counter and handed me a key. "Room 7, it said. "Stay in room 7. Don't go near the others," he said, his voice cold. Confused, I accepted the key and walked to the room. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, but I was too tired to care. As I made my way to the door, I noticed the hallway was strangely quiet, not a single sound. The motel felt abandoned. When I entered room 7, it was eerily still. The lights flickered once before settling into a dim, yellow glow. The bed was old, but the sheets looked clean enough. I dropped my bag on the floor and sat on the bed, my eyes scanning the room. Something felt off about the room. The air was too thick, like it was holding its breath. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, but I convinced myself it was just exhaustion playing tricks on me. I lay down, trying to sleep, but the quiet was suffocating. My mind raced, my thoughts tangled with the strange warning the man had given me. I closed my eyes, but then I heard it, a faint tapping, like fingernails against wood. It came from the wall next to the bed. Soft at first, barely noticeable, but it grew louder. Tap, tap, tap. I shot up, my heart pounding. The room was still, nothing had changed. I looked around, but I couldn't see anything unusual. The tapping continued, now more insistent, closer. I turned toward the wall, my breath shallowed suddenly. The door opened. A figure stood in the doorway, a silhouette in the dim light. It was a woman, her face hidden in shadow, her body unnaturally still. "You shouldn't be here." The voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it chilled me to the bone. Before I could speak, the door slammed shut. I scrambled to get up, but the room began to shift. The walls seemed to close in, the floor buckled under my feet, and the temperature dropped so rapidly I could see my breath. Then the tapping stopped. I looked at the walls. There were no doors, no windows, just walls closing in on me. My panic surged as I tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. I turned back to the mirror above the dresser. My reflection distorted, the woman's face now staring back at me. Her eyes were empty. "You should never have come." Her voice echoed, the walls groaning as they shifted again. I ran to the window and tried to break the glass, but it wouldn't break. I screamed, but the room swallowed the sound. The last thing I remember is the reflection in the woman's face, moving closer, her fingers reaching out toward me. Then, nothing. I woke up on the gravel outside the motel. The fog was gone, the parking Lot empty. The motel had vanished, leaving no trace behind. No sign, no building, just a stretch of empty road. But I know what I saw, and every night since. I hear the tapping, getting closer and closer. I had been on the road for what felt like days. The endless highway stretched ahead, the night sky dark and oppressive. My eyes were heavy with exhaustion, and I knew I couldn't drive any further. That's when I saw it, the Pine Ridge Motel, tucked away at the edge of the woods. The neon sign buzzed faintly, the lights flickering as if they were about to die. I pulled into the gravel lot, desperate for rest. The office was small, almost claustrophobic. Behind the counter, an elderly woman sat, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Her eyes, a dull shade of gray, flicked up as I entered. "I need a room for the night," I said, my voice tired. She didn't say anything but simply slid a key across the counter. "Room 6, it read. She gestured toward the hallway, and I took the key, making my way to the room. The hall was dimly lit, with faded carpet underfoot. The air smelled musty, like old wood and dust. When I reached room 6, I noticed a strange chill. I shrugged it off and unlocked the door. The room was small and sparsely furnished, but it looked clean enough. A bed, a nightstand, a dresser. Nothing too fancy. I set my things down and sat on the edge of the bed. But the room felt ... off. There was an eerie quietness in the air, a stillness that didn't feel natural. I brushed it aside, too tired to worry about it. I closed my eyes, hoping to fall asleep quickly, but as I lay there, the silence grew heavier. Then, I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from somewhere in the room, but I couldn't figure out where. It sounded like nails tapping against wood, or perhaps a soft knock on the door. I sat up, heart racing. The tapping stopped. I hesitated, then stood and went to the door. I opened it, expecting to see someone in the hallway, but there was no one, just the dark, quiet corridor. I stepped out for a moment, but the silence pressed in around me, too thick to ignore. The tapping resumed. It was coming from inside the room now. I rushed back to the bed, my eyes scanning the room, searching for the source. And then I saw it, the dresser. The wood was scratched, deep gouges running down its side. The tapping was coming from within the drawers, as if something or someone was trapped inside. I stepped closer, my hand trembling as I reached for the drawer handle. The moment I touched it, the tapping stopped. A strange sense of dread washed over me, but I couldn't stop myself. I pulled the drawer open. Nothing. The drawer was completely empty, but the air felt suffocating. I shut it quickly, my breath shallow. As I turned away, I noticed something in the reflection of the mirror. A figure, standing in the corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light. I spun around, but the corner was empty. The room suddenly felt colder. My breath became visible in the air, and I could feel the weight of something unseen, something watching me. I grabbed my bag, my hands shaking. The door wouldn't open. I pulled at the handle, but it was stuck. The tapping began again. Louder now, frantic, coming from the walls. I turned back toward the mirror, and the figure was there closer. This time, its face shadowed, eyes hollow and dark. "Leave." The voice was barely a whisper, but it echoed in my mind. "Leave now, before it's too late." I turned to the door again, panic rising in my chest. With a final tug, the door opened. I didn't look back as I ran out of the room and into the parking lot. The motel was silent, but I could still hear the tapping, distant but persistent, following me. When I glanced back one last time, the motel was gone. The parking lot, the building, everything was empty. I didn't stop running until I reached the next town. But the tapping, I still hear it. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see the figure in the mirror. After hours of driving, I was exhausted. The only sign of civilization on the long stretch of highway was the rest stop motel, its flickering neon lights barely visible in the dark. The place looked worn down, but I didn't have much choice. I pulled into the parking lot and entered the small office. The room was dimly lit, and an old man sat behind the counter, eyes focused on a tattered book. He looked up just long enough to hand me a key, wordlessly. Room 13, it read. I wasn't superstitious, so I took it and walked toward the room. It was the only vacancy, and I was too tired to care. The room smelled musty, the walls yellowed with age. The bed was lumpy and uncomfortable, but it was better than nothing. As soon as I closed my eyes, a soft whisper filled the air. Help me. I froze, heart pounding. The room was still. I sat up, looking around. The whisper seemed to be coming from the walls, almost like a distant murmur, but I couldn't pinpoint the source. Maybe I was just tired, I told myself. But then, it came again. Help me. It wasn't the wind. It was closer, urgent, desperate. I jumped out of bed and walked to the door, opening it to the dimly lit hallway. It was silent, but there was an eerie feeling in the air. The fluorescent lights flickered above me, casting long shadows down the hall. I quickly returned to my room, locking the door behind me. The room felt colder now. The whispers continued, each one louder and more desperate. I turned on the bedside lamp, hoping the light would bring me comfort. But as I stared into the mirror above the dresser, I noticed something strange, a figure, standing just behind me in the reflection. I spun around, but there was nothing there. I walked back toward the door, my mind racing. The whispers became more frantic, echoing off the walls, pleading, "Please, help me." The temperature in the room dropped, my breath becoming visible in the air. I tried the door again, but it wouldn't open. The walls seemed to press in on me. I was trapped. I turned to the window, but the blinds were shut tight. The phone on the nightstand was dead, no dial tone. The silence felt suffocating. The whispers grew louder, surrounding me. I was about to scream when the door suddenly flew open. The old man from the front desk was standing there, his face pale, eyes wide in fear. "You shouldn't have taken room 13, he whispered, his voice shaking. "It's cursed. No one ever leaves." Before I could react, the room began to shake. The walls cracked and the ceiling groaned under pressure. I could feel the building shifting, like it was alive. Then everything went dark. I woke up outside, lying on the cold gravel of the parking lot. I blinked, disoriented, and looked around. The motel was gonna vanished. There was no sign it had ever existed, no trace of its faded sign or cracked windows. But I still hear it sometimes. The whispers, and sometimes, in the dead of night, they return. Help me. I had been driving for hours, my eyes heavy with exhaustion, when I saw the Whispering Pines Motel on the side of the road. Its neon sign flickered weakly, and the building looked old, worn down, but I needed rest. I pulled into the nearly empty lot and went inside the office. A pale woman with wide eyes handed me a key to room 9. She didn't say much, but I sensed something off about her. "Room 9 is the only one left," she murmured. I took the key and headed to my room. The instant I walked in, I noticed a strange chill in the air. The room itself was simpler bed, a small TV, and a faded dresser. The floor creaked beneath my feet, but it was silent otherwise. I tried to ignore the growing unease as I settled into bed, but then I heard it. Whispers. Soft, almost unintelligible, but unmistakable. "Help me." I froze, sitting up in bed. The room was still. The whispers continued, growing louder. "Help me." My heart began to race. I walked toward the door, half expecting to see someone standing there, but when I opened it, the hallway was empty. The silence was unbearable, and yet, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I returned to the room, locking the door behind me. The whispers came again, desperate and pleading. Please, ... help me, ... I tried to ignore it, convinced I was just overtired. But as I lay there, the air grew colder. I pulled the blanket tighter, my breath visible in the air. Suddenly I noticed something strange. The mirror above the dresser began to fog up, as though someone was breathing on it. Slowly, a figure began to appear in the mista, shadowy figure, standing just behind me. I turned around, my heart pounding. But the room was empty. In a panic, I checked the door again. As I touched the handle, the walls around me seemed to shift. The floor creaked beneath me, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic. Help me, help me. I backed away from the door, my breath shallow. The room seemed to close in on me. I glanced at the mirror again and saw a dark figure, its hollow eyes staring back at me. I ran to the door and threw it open, but the hallway outside wasn't the same. The walls were covered in strange symbols, and the floorboards groaned beneath my feet. I turned to run, but as I reached the stairs, the woman from the office appeared at the bottom. You shouldn't have taken room 9, she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. That room is where it all began. Before I could ask what she meant, the building shuddered, and I bolted out the door into the night. I haven't gone back since, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers. Help me. I had been driving for hours. The road stretched endlessly before me, the white lines blurring together as I struggled to keep my eyes open. My GPS had long since lost signal, and I had no choice but to follow the old Route 66. It was late too, latent. The thought of another hour of driving with no sign of a rest stop pushed me to pull into the first place I saw. That place was a motel, barely visible under the dim glow of a flickering neon sign that read, "The Last Stop Motel." The place looked abandoned, with an air of rot hanging around it. Still, the exhaustion in my bones made me desperate. I parked in the lot, which was empty, except for a single car in the far corner. I walked toward the office, trying to shake off the creeping feeling of unease that settled in my stomach. The door opened with a creak, and I was met by a man behind the desk. His clothes were old-fashioned, his hair unkempt. He looked at me with sad, tired eyes, like he had seen too much and wanted to say nothing more. His voice was low when he spoke. "We have a room for you. Room 7. I nodded, not bothering to ask for anything more. The man handed me the key, one of those old, brass ones, and I took it, barely noticing the cold chill that ran through my fingers as I touched it. The room was nothing special, just a bed, a desk, and a small bathroom. But there was a distinct stench in the air, something sour that made me wrinkle my nose. I pulled the curtains open, trying to get some fresh air, but the outside world felt strangely silent, like everything had been muted. I tried to sleep, but the more I laid there, the more I felt something was wrong. The silence outside was almost oppressive, and the shadows in the room seemed to twist and move. When I finally drifted off, I thought I heard something knock at the door. I opened my eyes, but no one was there. I got up, checked the peephole, but there was nothing on the other side. My heart was racing, but I told myself it was just my imagination. I went back to bed, only to be woken again by the knocking louder. This time, thump, thump, thump. I bolted out of bed, heart pounding, and opened the door. But once again, there was no one there. I stepped into the hallway, now fully awake, feeling the hairs on my neck stand up. Then, I noticed something odd. The hallway lights flickered, and the walls seemed to shift. The pattern on the wallpaper began to twist, forming faces that seemed to move, whispering, calling out to me. I backed away from the door, trying to shake the disorienting vision from my mind. The silence was deafening again, but something in the air had changed. It felt like the very building was alive, watching, waiting. The knocks came again. But this time, they weren't coming from the door. They came from the walls. I pressed my ear against the cold wood of the wall beside me, and I heard it whispering voices, pleading, begging for help. A woman's voice cried out, "Let me out." I stumbled back in shock, but something strange happened. The door to my room creaked, open on its own. My heart skipped a beat, and I took a step toward it. Inside, the room seemed darker, as if the shadows had taken on a life of their own. I felt an icy grip on my shoulder, and I turned, but there was no one there. Panic surged through me. I ran back into the room, grabbing my belongings, but the air felt thick, suffocating. The room was alive, breathing, like it was closing in on me, and then I heard the man's voice again, soft and almost soothing. "It's too late." The walls began to shift again, twisting into shapes that resembled faces twisted, grotesque faces, staring at me, their mouths opening in silent screams. I fled, running out of the motel room and into the parking lot. My heart was racing, my breaths shallow. The neon sign flickered once more, casting a red glow over the empty lot. I ran to my car and slammed the door shut, but when I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The man was standing outside the motel office, staring directly at me, his eyes hollow and empty. He never blinked. I drove off without looking back, but I knew, deep down, that I had escaped more than just a strange night. The motel had a power of its own, a pull that refused to let go. As I left the road behind, I glanced at my rearview mirror one last time, and for a brief moment, I swore I saw the faint outline of a face, the man, watching me leave. My name is Sarah, and I've never been one to believe in the supernatural. I always chalked up creepy events to coincidence or overactive imagination. But all of that changed the night I stayed at the Desert Mirage Motel. Doubt it wasn't a planned stop. I had been driving for hours, my car's engine rattling like it was about to give out. The motel, standing alone in the vast desert, looked like it had been there for decades. The neon sign flickered, casting an eerie red glow that made me uneasy. But it was the only place around 4 miles. I checked in, greeted by a clerk who seemed strangely distant. His smile was stiff, like it had been rehearsed. He handed me the key, which was attached to a heavy, rusted metal tag with the number room 13 etched into it. "Enjoy your stay," he said, his voice flat, void of any warmth. I smiled politely, though a wave of discomfort settled in my chest. I thought about asking for another room, but something told me I was being ridiculous. After all, it's just a motel, right? The room itself wasn't much better. Flickering fluorescent lights cast an unsettling glow across the chipped furniture. The bed was stiff, the blanket threadbare. The air smelled like mildew, and the bathroom door creaked open with a loud groan. I tried to make myself comfortable, but the silence in the room felt suffocating, like the walls were closing in on me. I took a shower, hoping it would help me relax. But the moment I stepped out of the bathroom, I saw a figure in the corner of the room, just standing there. It was a woman, her features obscured by the darkness, but I could feel her eyes boring into me. My heart raced, and I blinked, but when I opened my eyes again, she was gone. I thought I had imagined it, so I convinced myself it was just the exhaustion, playing tricks on me. But the feeling of being watched lingered, growing stronger by the minute. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I could hear soft whispers. It wasn't in any language I recognized, just an incoherent murmur, like voices trapped behind the walls. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, trying to ignore the growing unease. Then, the whispers stopped, replaced by a single sound, the creaking of the bed. I opened my eyes, but nothing was there. Yet, the mattress beneath me was moving, as though something invisible was shifting it from side to side. I jumped up, my heart pounding. I ran to the door, but it wouldn't budge. I pulled at the handle, but it was stuck. Panicking, I rushed to the window and tried to open it, but it was sealed shut. Suddenly, the light flickered again, and I saw her, the woman, standing in front of me now, her face clear and unmistakable. Her eyes were black, empty, soulless pits of darkness. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out, just the whispers, growing louder, becoming maddening. I stumbled backward, falling to the floor. The room began to spin. The walls closed in, and I felt the suffocating pressure of the air around me. And then, it all stopped. I woke up in my bed, the morning light streaming through the window. My heart was still racing, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Had it been a nightmare, or had it been real? I rushed to the motel office to check out. The clerk looked at me with the same lifeless gaze. "You stayed in room 13, didn't you?" he asked, almost knowingly. I nodded, my voice trembling. "That room is cursed," he said. "No one ever stays there more than one night." I turned and ran, not bothering to ask any more questions. I had to get out of that place. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and for just a moment, I saw her reflection, the woman, standing by the side of the road, her eyes locked onto mine, and I knew then that she was never going to let me go.